Namaskar, Assalamu alaikum, Shat Shri Akal, hello, and welcome salute to all our viewers. Welcome to the second episode of Scroll Ideas. If you're new here, what is Scroll Ideas? Every episode, we're going to take a topic that Indians are discussing, debating, and exiting family WhatsApp groups over, and we're going to dissect it with a particularly brainy guest. It's a bit of a safe space for nerds away from the craziness that is Indian TV nowadays. And you'll be doing all of this with me, your host, Shoaib Daniyal. For the second episode of Scroll Ideas, I'm extremely pleased to welcome historian Nikhil Menon, who joins us from the University of Notre Dame. He's written a fantastic history of planning in Nehruvian India called Planning Democracy, in which he charts how planning became extremely popular, including in one delicious instance of Mohammad Rafi singing it. We wanted to bring it onto the show, but our producer said it would result in a copyright strike. So you just have to Google it yourself or read the book. And we're here to discuss how planning became so popular. Uh, it went through every, it suffused politics. It went into Bollywood. It even went into a group of very influential sadhus called the Bharatiya Sadhu Samaj. We'll come to that, how sadhus are related to planning. uh, and it sort of kind of died out. So where we are right now, I guess, is we're past the great golden age of centralized planning. I think both globally and in India, and it's very much a free market age. And we'll go through that history of the exciting life and I guess the death of centralized planning with Nikhil Menon. Welcome to the show, Nikhil.
Thank you so much, Shoaib. Thank you for having me on.
I'm glad you could make it. It must be really early where you are right now.
Yes, it's fairly early in the morning, yes. But
Thank
I'm
you.
very
That's
happy to be
always.
on the second episode of Scroll Ideas.
We're very glad to have you, especially if it's early. We're going to jump right into it. One of the most fascinating things that I find really about planning, it became so popular, or it was one of the central poles of Indian democracy in its first couple of decades, at least, was that the freedom movement under Gandhi was actually not really very conducive to ideas like planning, big industry. In fact, Mr. Gandhi was very clear that he considered them evils that uh, British colonialism had actually brought in. Yet, Nehru sort of kind of turned it around and made this such a popular idea that Rafi was singing about it, and Dilip Kumar was reportedly, as you mentioned in your book, wanting people to donate to the plans. How did Nehru pull this off? It seemed like quite a political trick.
Yes, I mean that's a great question. I think that it's well known that Gandhi was opposed to industrialization, certainly modern factory-based economic systems. This goes back to the early 1900s to Hind Swaraj onwards, in which he refers to Western industrialization as factory civilization. But I think that I would sort of push back on your characterization of the freedom movement being opposed to
Right.
industrialization and to planning, because in some ways Gandhi, though he was the vehicle of the mass movement of the Congress Party, his economic ideas in some ways sat um, at ill at odds with and ill at ease with the views of many economic modernists within the Congress Party. So, for example, the economic critique of the colonial system, going back to the late 19th century, from Dadabhai Naoroji onwards, R.C. Dutt, Gokhale, Delang, all of these people, all of it was a critique of the kind of economic system that the British put in place in India, but it advocated for industrialization of Indians by Indians themselves, right? And so going back to the 19th century, you have this legacy and the early 20th century. And in some ways, people like Nehru there and Bose as well were two very important figures who continued that kind of critique of the colonial economic enterprise, which is very different from the kind of critique that Gandhi advanced. And so I think that we should think of the Congress Party from the late 1930s onwards as being quite firmly behind industrialization and certainly planned-based industrialized societies. So in the 1938 Congress conference, with Bose as president, very clearly the Congress manifesto mentions that India needs a centralized planning board and that it needs modern industry. And this was backed not just by the Congress party, of course, but communists in India backed industrialization. But so did, and this might come as a surprise to some, so did India's industrialists. J.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, Lala Shriram, all of them believed that India, naturally believed that India must industrialize, being industrialists themselves, but they also believed that India needed a planning body to help India industrialize, which is why in the mid-1940s, in fact, in the year 1944, we see a rash of plans across India. You have the Congress. Congress, of course, has its plans. The colonial government has its own planning department. There is a Muslim League plan. There is a Gandhian plan as well, with a foreword written by Gandhi himself. There is a plan, the Bombay plan, or what is known as the Tata Birla plan by industrialists. All of them in different ways arguing with different specific policies, but arguing for the state in an independent India to play a central role in directing the course of the economy.
Right. I mean, that's fascinating. The fact that even industrialists were so keen on planning. What was their thinking? Like, why did they think that having centralized planning would be beneficial for large industry in India?
Absolutely. I think that what we need to recover is, and my role as a historian has been to try to recover through this book, a sort of lost world of economic ideas in which planning was a very mainstream choice in the early and the mid 20th century, especially. We have to go back to the late 19th century with Meiji Restoration in Japan, with the first 5-year plan in 1928 in the Soviet Union, both of which really showed to the rest of the world what as a government sort of putting its resources behind in the economy could do for a underdeveloped economy, right? And so that the course for these countries had to be different from that of the West, which had had 200 years to industrialize, whereas countries like Japan and the Soviet Union, and after that in the 1930s, after the Great Depression in America, with the New Deal under FDR, the President Roosevelt, again, the government playing a very important role. In 1945, the Labour Party comes to power in Britain with Clement Attlee as the Prime Minister. The Labour Party's manifesto on the election campaign explicitly says that the Labour Party believes in socialism and believes in a planning-based economy. Right. So it is actually, so the government in charge of the Indian Empire under which India was oppressed itself believed in some ways in a planned economy. And the industrialists therefore believed that, and within India, so this is a sort of international story, but even within India, there was a long history of technocrats and industrialists believing in planning. So from the 1920s onwards, Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya, who is a Mysorean and an engineer, civil engineer who's served the princely state of Mysore, on whose birthday today actually India celebrates Engineers Day, because he's seen as sort of one of India's sort of founding or leading early engineers. He writes a book in the 1920s about a planned economy for India. He writes another book in 1934 arguing for a centralized planning board that puts together what he calls the brightest minds of the generation to come up with plans, 10-year plans for India. In 1934, G.D. Birla, the sort of iconic industrialist and nationalist, speaks at the floor of FICCI, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce, and he's speaking to capitalists, making a plea for planning, saying that any future modern society needs a planned economy, needs the central government to back it, and needs a plan in order for India to sort of leap forward economically. And so one is that there's some debate amongst historians about why it is that in the 1940s, especially, these big industrialists like the Tatas, the Lala Shrirams, the Birlas, why they get behind planning. And so one argument is that there is a genuine commingling of interests, a genuine sort of meeting of horizons of the nationalist parties and of the industrialists, in which they both believe that this is what is necessary for India to overturn its colonial economy and the way in which India has been exploited, that the only path forward is a planned economy. Some other scholars have actually contended that that might be being too charitable towards these industrialists, and that what they actually realized was, one, that planning had such was so popular across political parties, whether from the Hindu right to the communist left,
Right.
that there was no space to making a free market argument. The free markets were associated with colonialism and therefore tainted. And so therefore you had to make an argument within what was seen as the median positions of the political mainstream. But also that the other self-interest reasons that industrialists might have had was that industrialists weren't really interested in having an open economy in which they would have to compete with, say, American made steel, Japanese made goods. And so actually closing the economy for already established industrialists like the Birlas and the Tatas allowed them a vast home market in which there was no competition, right? And so they would have a sort of a market of approximately 300 million people to which they could cater to without needing to be internationally competitive.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point because I think British colonialism did give a lot of favors to non-Indian industrialists. So it was almost like turning back the clock a bit, if you could put it that way. Especially if you were a big industrialist. Maybe it didn't work out if you were an Indian consumer,
Exactly.
but at
And
least,
this was a
yeah,
point of debate with industrialists from
right,
the 1930s onwards, and scholars have charted this, which is that they were always railing against Britain's sort of discriminatory tariff policies that favored
right,
foreign businesses and that hurt Indian businesses, especially big businesses.
right. And what you said, this there are always debates around planning today, and very often what I find is that they get reduced to the personality of Nehru, which is, I mean, it is what it is, and it's always exciting to debate a man. But I think what we miss is what you just said, that it was the consensus of its time. I mean, whether you were an industrialist, whether you were a person on the Hindu right, whether you were a communist, it was. I mean, one of the things that I find again and again is that when you speak of planning, it is the idiom of modern development as opposed to something in the past. It is the cutting edge tech, so to speak, of its time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you're right to say that. I mean, of course, we live in an age in which everything Nehru is considered tainted, and so planning as being associated with Nehru and rightly associated with Nehru is seen as bad. But I think that there's a lot of public confusion about planning and import substitution and why India had a closed economy. And so maybe it's
Right.
worth discussing it in sort of two or three parts. And so the first part is that we need to remember that Nehru, in some ways, gets credit if you believe in planning, and for people who believed in planning at the time, Nehru got credit because he put the political muscle behind it. But Nehru did not invent the idea of planning. He did not make planning internationally popular. In some ways, Nehru was sticking very much to what was economic orthodoxy at the time. He was picking a mainstream policy choice. And so we
Right.
have to go back to a time in which that was the mainstream political choice. And so, whatever mainstream economic choices are today, we have to think of Nehru being in his time picking those mainstream economic choices. And why do I say that? It's because economics as a field was, developing in the 1940s and the 1950s, and across the world, development economists, the leading development economists of the world at the time, Raoul Prebisch, Hans Singer, John Kenneth Galbraith, Arthur Lewis, Gunnar Myrdal, Richard Stone, some of whom went on to win some of the first Nobel Prizes in economics, all of them basically backed the idea of the state playing a very important role in the government and of having some sort of a sort of import substitution as a way for a newly decolonized nation to advance economically. Now, those are foreign economists. What about amongst economists in India? When the second five-year plan was presented in draft form in late 1955, early 1956 to a panel of 21 economists, only one of them, B.R. Shenoy, dissented. B.R. Shenoy was a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, which was an organization that had been started by Friedrich Hayek and was sort of a free market, laissez-faire economics organization. But apart from him, everybody else basically agreed with the broad strategy while quibbling with some numbers. Think of in the present day who are the best known economists of India today. I mean, you'd say perhaps Manmohan Singh, Amartya Sen, Jagdish Bhagwati, as I refer to them in the book as I said, the holy triad of Indian
Right.
economists in the
Right.
contemporary age. All three of them, at the time in the late 1950s and early 1960s, believed in planned economic growth. In fact, Jagdish Bhagwati, who has since been one of the biggest critics,
Right.
state playing a role, in fact, today is seen as a sort of as a sort of hero of anti
Right.
statist policies and has been consistently that for at least 3 decades. But in the early part of his career, he worked for the Planning Commission. He worked for Pitambar Pant at the Planning Commission in Delhi. And he says so himself in his own writings and his own interviews. He said that we had all drunk the Kool-Aid at the time, and that when Mahalanobis came to Oxford, where Jagdish Bhagwati was then doing a sort of was doing a scholarship, Mahalanobis asked him to come back to India to work on planning, and Jagdish Bhagwati says that I was very happy to be one of the professor's boys because he thought of Mahalanobis as
Right.
being the cutting edge. And so Mahalanobis and Jagdish Bhagwati says that, as Jagdish Bhagwati sort of quips jokingly, he said that maybe one of India's fates and downfalls was having brilliant economists, and that we all believed in this economic theory that he believes did not pan out in the long term. So I
Right.
think that's one part of it being mainstream. But I also think we need to distinguish between planning and import substitution. You see,
Right.
because planning was adopted by several countries in the mid 20th century across the world. So yes, there is planning in the Soviet Union. There is planning in China. There's planning in China even today, for that matter.
Right.
But in the mid 20th century, Japan is planning, South Korea is planning, Vietnam is planning, Malaysia is planning, France is, Argentina is, Ghana, Sudan, Tanzania, and other 20 nations in Africa.
Right.
All decolonizing nations are planning. And what is different is, and so somebody might rightly ask, well, why did Japan do so well? Why did South Korea do so well? Why did we not match their growth rate?
Mhm.
And so some scholars have argued, like Atul Kohli and Vivek Chibber, that the techniques within planning differed. India followed import substitution. Those other countries followed an
Right.
export-led model. And so lastly, the question would be then, why did we choose export? Why didn't we choose the export model?
Right.
And I think for that, we need to look at India's own history and India's nationalist movement, in which if you are to be an export-led economy, you have to kind of be an open economy because you have to allow for open tariff barriers, because otherwise
Mhm.
countries will also impose tariffs on your goods. And now being an open economy was just seen as extremely suspect after 200 years of colonialism in India. And so
Right.
it was sort of marked by that brush. And given the history of Swadeshi as well, there was a strain in Indian thinking, again, from the Hindu right to the communist left, that India needed to be self-reliant, that being independent meant being self-reliant. And so, and again, as I
Which
said,
still exists. You know,
sorry?
this strain
Exactly.
still exists.
Yes,
Right.
with Atmanirbhar
Yeah.
Bharat, Make
With
in India,
Atmanirbhar
that's
and
a
Make in
strain
India.
that's
Right.
coming back. Yes,
Right.
and this was again, as I said earlier, was something that was endorsed by industrialists as well, perhaps for self-interested reasons. And so, as this economist I.G. Patel, who went on to be the director of IIM Ahmedabad and LSE, etc., and he was a young economist at the time in the 1950s. He would say that Nehru's obsession was industrialization. It wasn't planning or it wasn't import substitution,
Right.
but industrialization was the obsession, and this was seen as the path to getting there.
Right. And I think the point that you made about it being a colonial reaction. I think sitting here we forget as to what a central ideological pole laissez-faire and free trade was for the British Empire. I mean, there's this fantastic history of the 43 famine
Right,
by historian Janam Mukherjee. It's called Hungry Bengal, and there is a price controls conference in 42. When the British are seeing that Bengal could face although it's had a good crop, but it's still prices are going up,
right,
and it's quite remarkable that their solution, their prognosis is free trade. And
yeah,
of course, I mean, it's disaster. So I mean, you can look at it politically that you've had incredible starvation, and like, I mean, of many effects. And for a politician in a popularly elected politician in 1950 to say that, oh, we're going to follow the economic policies of what is now seen as the British Empire at that time.
right,
it's a tough nut to crack, I think. So yeah, I mean, maybe even if there was a non-Nehru, we would still be having this debate. I guess there's a high chance of it.
Right. I mean, I also think that it's worth pointing out that planning itself, people assume sort of quote unquote failed immediately, but
Right.
even critics of centralized economic planning. So, for example, today the chief economic advisor to Prime Minister Modi, Vivek Debroy, has written a piece saying that actually in the 1950s, planning actually worked to develop industrial capacity in India. It did deliver certain rates of growth that were not seen under the colonial regime. Another sort of critic of statist economic policies, Niranjan Rajadaksha, who writes, who's written for the Mint in the past. He's also talked about how these policies were actually crucial to spurring growth and to delivering rates of growth, as Angus Madison, a sort of economist, has calculated. Between 1900 and 1950, India's rate of year-on-year economic growth was less than 1%. Between 1950 and the mid-1960s, it grew to 4%. That's a sort of quadrupling of the growth rate, which, going from such a low base that India had, was, I think, a significant achievement. And I think that as even these critics have admitted, that the license permit Raj really sets in from the late 1960s onwards, especially under Indira Gandhi, when you have a spate of bank nationalization, life insurance nationalizations, and a politicization of the Planning Commission itself.
Right. So is this so one of the? I mean, I'm glad you in your book you brought in Minu Masani, who is, for our viewers, is he'd fit in right in 2022, I guess, but in the 50s he was a bit of an oddball, I guess, considering he was a free marketeer. He was a Parsi Bombayite. And one of the things that you mention in your book is, he stands up and he says that, why aren't we focusing on consumer goods? And from 2022, it kind of seems such an obvious point that I can go out and buy any phone and any chocolate and whatever I want. Why wasn't there democratic pressure on Nehru and the Congress Party to ensure this immediately? How could he steer the Indian state towards making, say, steel and capital goods, which of course very important and the people who knew were very important were very few, maybe they were planners, but from the ground up, why wasn't there a groundswell of demand for these goods?
Yeah, I think that, Shoaib, the first thing that we need to remember is that we are, as you mentioned, talking about a time that was just, the Planning Commission was born 7 years after the Bengal famine, which cost,
Right.
1 million lives. I mean, so that's the kind of quote unquote consumer we're talking about. I mean, that's the level of dire
That's the
poverty
context
and
that we are
abject
in.
poverty we're talking about. And so
Right.
today there would be popular pressure for consumer goods in some ways, because we also have a fairly substantial middle class. I mean, however you want to define middle class, but it's still numbers in the tens of millions of people, right? And it's the people that pay income taxes, etc. At the time, we're talking about an overwhelmingly illiterate society and an overwhelmingly poor society with an extremely thin elite class. And so there wasn't, I think, the kind of pressure for consumer goods. Coming to Masani himself, at least it wasn't being able to have a job or have food or to prevent famines. Those seemed like more electorally pressing issues. Coming to Masani himself, Masani was this sort of dapper Parsi gentleman who was, one time congressy, one time socialist, as somebody put it at the time, now, running towards the right with all the fervor of an apostate, right? That he had converted his economic ideas and now is zealous
Right.
about them, now that he converted his views. Masani was openly pro-US and pro-market. And as I've said, there wasn't really much of a political constituency for that at the time. Even today, we see that a strictly pro-market, anti-welfare state politics is not popular, right? I mean, even under the BJP and Modi today, we have, as we've discussed, Atmanirbhar Bharat. We have all kinds of government provisions, all kinds of government safety nets that, some critics, some free market economists who are critics say that India should get over and that we need reforms. And this is the kind of thing that we see in business papers and internationally and in India. But the government is very skittish about doing it because politically it suspects that there might be ramifications. And so if it's politically dubious today, you can only imagine how much more difficult it might have been to consider or to have a constituency for that view in the 1950s or 60s. There was a political party, of course. Masani was part of the Swatantra Party, which Rajaji, C. Rajgopalachari, was one of the founders of. And it was founded in 1959, it did get several seats in parliament, but it never really had a mass constituency. Most of its members were ex-Congress people, and so they were well-known figures. And in the 1950s and 60s, across the political spectrum, there really was not a space for explicitly laissez-faire economic conservatism. That across the political spectrum, while people disagreed on secular politics, people disagreed on the size of the state, but people weren't critiquing whether the state should be playing an important role or not. You could have had even if the Jansangh was voted into power at the center, it was not inconceivable that the Jansangh at the time would become a sort of economic conservative party, at the time at least. And so,
in fact, the BJP is till now on paper a socialist party.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So,
right. I think that it's worth remembering the importance that the idea of socialism, vague as it has been in Indian history, that look at the kinds of people that have been called the socialists. Right, the BJP is socialist. In fact, as the scholar, Columbia scholar Siddhartha Kaviraj has argued that India, after independence, socialism became such a big umbrella term that it created this kind of socialist night in which all parties were black. Because the socialist label could be used if you were a Hindutvavadi, if you were a communist, if you're a Congressee, all of them claim to be socialist. And so I think that the Masani critique, the consumer goods critique, which was also made by some Bombay-based economists like C.N. Vakil, P.R. Brahmananda, B.R. Shenoy, there were some critiques politically and from expert economists, but it never really found traction in the electoral arena because India just did not have, I would argue, a kind of middle class constituency as driving its politics.
Right, and this is really the key that there was a popular pressure that made free market politics unviable. I guess. One of the most interesting things that I find when I'm reading stuff from the 50s and the 60s is that everybody's like you said, everybody's critiqued on socialism. It's like almost like you're saying you're not a good Christian. The way you say you're on a Christian world, your only critique can be in those bounds. Right. So it's a very common thing to say the British were acting un-Christian in India. That's one way to put it. So a lot of those controversies were within that framework.
Right.
What I wanted
Nehruji, in fact, wrote a book called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India as a way to shame the British.
Right, exactly. That's another very good example. So even the British, when they were at their worst, were at best un-British.
Right, yeah.
Right. So, in this, and this is something that you've discussed through your book, and I think a lot of people have also commented on. And this is such a relevant debate to where we are right now. This tension between popular pressure, which could be electoral democracy at its worst, it becomes maybe a form of populism, versus technocracy. The fact that you can have these incredibly smart eggheads in Calcutta and Delhi, and there'll be these 50 people who would tell India. In fact, even in sometimes what I find really remarkable is they'll even direct the finance minister and so on and so forth. It's really quite remarkable the fact that so much of power gets pulled into this small circle of experts. Is that a debate that's happening there? Are there people saying, whoa, why isn't Parliament taking policy and so on and so forth? Like, is there a technocracy versus democracy debate happening, or is Nehru really aware of that and is really walking on two stilts over there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that one of the running themes of my book is this sort of fracture that runs through planning between democracy and technocracy. And I think it's one of the fundamental tensions that we need to pay attention to, these pulls between popular electoral politics and populist electoral politics, and a technocratic politics that has this kind of bloodless quality and extremely cerebral quality. And I'd say that while the Planning Commission was technocratic, it might not have been inimical to democracy, but it certainly was in tension with democracy. And that the technocratic aspects of the Planning Commission did puncture big holes in the Nehruvian argument that Indian planning was democratic planning, that it somehow reflected the Indian people. Of course, and we might discuss this later, the Nehru government went to great lengths to make the plans popular. I mean, the entire second half of my book is about how there were exhibitions, there were traveling mobile vans and bullock carts that were projecting films about the Planning Commission and the 5-year plans. There were these sadhus that were promoting the ideas of the plans. There were voluntary troops such as the Bharat Sevak Samaj that were promoting plans, all with this Nehruvian idea that the Indian populace needed to be aware of this grand social and political and economic experiment that they were part of. Planning had become central to the story of modern India. Planning was central to the story of an independent India making its way in the world. And that if Indians knew what they were part of, that they would work harder towards it. And so partly there's an idealism to it, but part of it is just that India had limited state capacity, and it knew that the state alone could not deliver it. It needed people to work towards it. In what ways? By investing in the ways that the Planning Commission wanted it to, like instead of saving it in certain kinds of bonds and etc. But also in engaging in voluntary activities, in building a bund, or in helping build a dam, or in helping build a dispensary or a hospital, or laying a road without being paid by the government. And a lot of this happened, and I lay this out in my book. An enormous hundreds of thousands of man hours just donated to the government in order to fulfill these 5-year plans, because there was popular buy-in, at least in some sections, about the idea of a free India engaging in these plans. Regarding the technocracy itself, yes, it is a closed group of intellectuals who are directing the ways in which the economy would proceed. But in some ways, it is tempered by the fact that the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, and usually the Minister for Planning and the Minister for Industries sat on the Planning Commission. Now, these are, of course, cabinet level appointments. These are selected by the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister, of course, is from a party that is popularly elected. And at the time of Nehru, Nehru himself was the primary vote catcher. So in some ways, there is a tether. And so the way it worked in Nehruvian India was that the populism which Nehru could have wielded, because he was such a commanding popular figure at the time, was tempered by the fact that Nehru himself, in some ways, was in love with the idea of expertise and with technocrats. And so he was willing to cede that authority to technocrats to whom he felt that these questions actually naturally belonged to. An issue with contemporary populism is that today's populism is untethered to this technocratic element. In fact, populism very often, and internationally, not just in India, is often anti-intellectual. And we see that, for example, with things such as demonetization in India, right? That a political move and a massively important economic move that seemed to have been taken without much expert economic input. Now, we can go back and say the 1950s perhaps was the expert input that Nehru got always the best? That can be debated. But in today's India, especially with a move like demonetization, you see that there was almost no expert input. Across the board, economists, you'd be hard pressed to find an economist of reputable standing who thought that demonetization as it was carried out was a smart policy. And so I think that there is this tension about how much power do you allow technocrats to arrogate to themselves versus how much of a populist kind of government do you want. And I think that going in each extreme can be problematic. And the way in which it might have worked in the Nehruvian era is that there was this tension, but it was kind of the fact that Nehru was such a popular leader, but at the same time was the person most convinced about planning, and the technocracy allowed it, in a sense, to hold in suspension in some ways, whether for good or bad, but that's what allowed it to work. And we see the wheels coming off it under somebody like Indira Gandhi, where it became entirely politicized. And after Indira Gandhi, of course, the Planning Commission entirely begins to lose its powers to the Finance Ministry.
So under Indira Gandhi, it was a completely political body for her political aggrandizement.
Right. It became much more politicized. The decisions about what policies to follow seem to have been motivated a lot more by politics. The move
Right.
to, for example, bank nationalization, the nationalization of other parts of the Indian industry seem to have been influenced by other political factors as well. And there wasn't the same kind of deference that Nehru had for economic experts and for, in a sense, admitting that was a domain that Nehru was not the best at and was not someone who really knew the tools and knew how to wield them. And so we see that the scholars have written about how under Indira Gandhi, the slow deterioration of the Planning Commission's powers in some ways gets arrested. And once again, the Planning Commission becomes very powerful, but it becomes powerful not because the experts are powerful, but it's because it became the means through which Indira Gandhi could exercise her powers. And that, of course, is not very surprising, given that the rampant centralization of authority is a feature of and not a bug of the Indira Gandhi, the prime ministership.
Yeah. This is like a nerdy sort of point, but how like one I was reading an opinion by a former Chief Justice of India, Kesub Rao, and he flat out calls the Planning Commission unconstitutional, and he says that it was actually the job of the Finance Commission to mostly do what, and maybe individual ministries. Is this like, again, was this just the towering personality of Nehru just pushed this through? Like how did the Planning Commission arrogate these incredible financial powers to itself?
I mean, I'd say again that there's a danger of making it entirely about Nehru, because if it was, I should preface this by saying I'm not a legal scholar or a constitutional expert,
Right.
but having done this research on the Planning Commission, it seems very surprising that if it was entirely unconstitutional and entirely based on Nehru's personality, that we had a Planning Commission from 1950 to 2014 with opposition governments in charge as well, right? I mean non-Congress governments presiding over it as well. I think that I would say that it's not an anti-constitutional body as much as an extra-constitutional one, by which I mean that it does not find mention within the Constitution, but it was not something that came as a surprise to anybody or to any political party, which is why I think we've had a Planning Commission under Congress governments, under Janta governments, under BJP government as well, because the need for this kind of expert planning body, as I said, goes back to Indian economists arguing for it and engineers arguing for it back in 1934, then in the late 1940s with the British colonial government also having its own planning department. But you're right to say that the powers of the Planning Commission did cause alarm amongst some people within the Indian government and amongst the intelligentsia. So, for example, John Mathai, one of our first finance ministers, resigns in 1950 very publicly in an embarrassment for the Nehru government, still a fledgling government that had not yet contested an election. Of course, the first elections were 1951, 1951, 52. And John Mathai, when he was resigning in these sort of series of interviews that he gave to reporters, one of the reasons that he cited for resigning were the powers that were being given to the Planning Commission, which was formed in March 1950. And he described it as a parallel cabinet. However, having read the letters between Mathai and Nehru at that time, over the few weeks in which Mathai was threatening to resign, Nehru was trying to get him not to resign, and in the end, he did resign. It seems from the letters that while he was concerned about the Planning Commission, there were other concerns that were perhaps more predominant, and that had to do with growing government expenditure, the Nehru Liaquat Pact, etc. So there were many other concerns as well, but this was something that the first finance minister of India, first finance minister to resign, did cite as a problem. And so others would pick up on this in the 1950s when they want to critique the Planning Commission's policies, saying that it's a parallel cabinet, that's a super cabinet. And the critique was that it's a super cabinet because it has these unelected technocrats, but it also has very important cabinet members, because the prime minister is the chairperson of the planning commission, and the finance minister is always also a part of the planning commission.
Right. The other, criticism that the planning commission gets, one is obviously the fact that it's a super cabinet, as you put it. It's often in the crosshairs. I mean, not anymore because it doesn't exist, but till it existed, was often in the crosshairs of federalists. The I mean, I've heard this. I've heard multiple chief this being put in the mouths of multiple chief ministers of them having to go with a begging bowl to the planning commission, including Mr. Modi, who eventually managed to, uh, I guess, take his revenge on the planning commission. Uh, it, what I want to know is that what is the political economy of this for Nehru? Is this a way for him to control states outside the Congress party? Because remember, this is a one-party polity practically, right? So is this, rather than going through the Congress party, which is one way to control the states, does this give Mr. Nehru, this power through Delhi to control the states? Is that one way through which it works?
I mean, I'd say that you could think of it as both as a power to control the dispersal of funds to states, but also, if you wanted to be more charitable, I mean, a critic could say it's a way of control. A supporter might say that it's a way in which you can ensure a holistic national development approach, in which, for example, states like that have been more affluent in India, such as, say, Gujarat, well, then sort of Maharashtra, or then sort of Bombay presidency, really, or Madras, or these states, or others in the south that have already had higher per capita GDPs, would not necessarily outstrip others without others having the chance to develop, right? So yes. So to come back, I'll come back to that point, but I think that it's worth going back to the idea of whether it is a tool of centralization. I think in its most formal sense, yes, it is a tool of centralization, and it was very much designed as a tool of centralization because the Congress believed in centralized economic planning. You will remember that one of the many objections that the Congress Party had to the cabinet mission plan that the British proposed in 1946 was that its tiered structure of having a sort of three federations of Indian states had a very weak center. Now, India would have been, quote unquote, independent. You would have Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India all together, but you'd have them in these federations of states, and that New Delhi would basically have only power over currency and foreign defense, right? That was unacceptable to the Congress Party because its ideas from the early 1930s onwards were for a powerful center that could direct economic development, because a fundamental part of the argument for independence had become that India didn't just need to become independent because we needed, Indians or brown people in charge instead of white people, but India needed to be independent because Indians could develop the Indian economy. And for that, the Congress Party believed that you needed a strong center. So the argument for centralization was kind of baked into the politics of the time. And the reasoning for the Planning Commission's powers was that the center had an interest that went beyond just that of each individual state. And so, for example, what if you had a state, say, in northern India or in eastern India, as there were many at the time, which was economically lagging Western India and Southern India, as they are even today. But those states had a river that could be dammed or had minerals that could be mined, and therefore you needed to build something there, or therefore you needed to build a factory, a steel factory there. But they did not have the resources for it. How were you to do it? Only a central government would be able to redeploy resources in order to be able to do that kind of thing. And so the argument was that centralization enabled sort of a holistic national growth in the way that if you let states do what they want to do on their own, you'd have some outlier states that did very, very well, but also many other states that didn't do well at all. And so I think that was the logic. Now, you might disagree with whether that worked or whether that was the right path even. Some might argue that, that states should just do the best that they can. But that was the logic of the Planning Commission. But that changed over time. Some people, even within the Planning Commission, thought that those powers were too extreme. And so with one of the deputy chairmen of the Planning Commission in the mid-1960s, D.R. Gadgil, he came up with what is known as the Gargill formula in the late 1960s, which basically meant that the dispersal powers of the Planning Commission were not just discretionary anymore, but that there was a set formula by which different states would get different amounts of money.
Right. I mean, I'm always very happy to discuss the cabinet mission plan. I don't know whether it's whether Mamata Banerjee knows it or whether she doesn't, but it kind of pops up around a couple of years back. She mentioned that the center should have three powers: defense, communication, and currency.
Right.
So I don't know whether she knows that this is something that was hotly debated, or whether she just, I guess, as a state chief minister, it's beneficial for her.
Right.
So, but I'm
If
kind
she
of
is referring to it, she should also know that West Bengal would not be its own state under that system. It would be part of like a whole slew of other states as well.
right, right. No, I'm not. I don't think she wanted grouping, but yeah,
Yeah.
she wanted limited central. She wanted the Congress view, I guess, of the cabinet mission plan,
Right.
no grouping. But yeah, I don't think whether I don't. I'm not sure whether she referenced that. One of the interesting things that I find about I mean, Partho Chatterjee in an essay describes this tension between politics and technocracy as a quarrelsome couple. Again, your book is extremely thorough about that. You go into this dynamic, and you just mentioned Demon, 15 minutes back, has has one couple, one part of that couple completely. One has politics, one is technocracy. Now out is it even possible to do central planning today in India, where you have a Modi versus Stalin and versus a Mamata? Like I mean, it was a one-party state when the Congress did it. Under India's, maybe even more vibrant democracy today, is it possible to do central planning?
I think that you're right to say that the period in which central planning seemed an extremely viable option was a time that the political scientist Rajni Kothari has described as the Congress system, right? It wasn't just a Congress government in Delhi and in some state capitals. It was the Congress government almost across the country. And the Congress as a sort of umbrella ideology, it was a sort of air that everyone breathed in. And that there were competitors, but nobody that really seemed like a real threat to the Congress party. And so at that time, again, these debates, as I said, about federalism also were tamped down because, of course, there were Congress governments in most states. And so there wasn't the situation that, say, Modi faced in the early 2000s, where he, as the chief minister of Gujarat, was going to a Congress government in Delhi, as the story goes, hat in hand, asking for funds, right? So that was different. And I think that it leads to the question of whether, in some ways, whether it was inevitable that the Modi government would do away with the Planning Commission. And historians are never like to say that anything is inevitable because we believe that things aren't inevitable. And part of our job is to show how things aren't inevitable and that contingency plays such an important role. But I think that it's fair to say that it was extremely probable that Modi would do away with planning for some of the reasons that you pointed out. One is the personal grouse that he might have harbored that many reporters have talked about. Second is the populist politics and the populist style that Modi champions that you referred to, and it's a populist style that is in keeping with many leaders across the world: Viktor Orban, Donald Trump, Putin, etc. People who are explicitly anti-technocratic and anti-intellectual. In fact, intellectuals are seen very often. Universities and intellectuals are seen as the enemy, as being the opposite of what the party in power represents. And so it was extremely probable that a body that represented technical expertise and intellectuals that was unelected was likely to face to be on the chopping block. And lastly, there is, of course, the desire to eclipse and to completely obliterate the Nehruvian legacy. Given how closely planning is associated with Nehru, I think that it was again something that it was likely that Modi would want to get beyond. But it's a worthwhile question to wonder whether, even if we did not have this kind of politics in power today, whether planning could come back. One model would be that there is a kind of planning that China still has 5-year plans. I mean, in India, we keep talking about the Chinese growth and how we need to catch up. There was a time a few years back in which we would talk about how maybe we can catch up. Now that seems very, very distant. Now it's more about whether we can keep China, outside our borders, more likely. Um, but China still has 5-year plans, and China is, a capitalist economy with a sort of command-style capitalist economy, right?
Right.
A market-based, centralized planning system. And so, in the pages of the Financial Times a couple of years back, I read a piece arguing about how the fact that we have big data today might enable planned economies like China's to actually thrive. That was actually the argument being made by people like Mahalanobis in the 1950s. Exactly that, with India's burgeoning statistical infrastructure, with all this fire hose of data coming from the National Sample Survey, etc., that we needed a data processing mechanism, and this revolutionary new technology, digital computers, were a way to solve that problem of big data. So in some ways, that same argument is being made today as well, with enhanced digital capabilities, that you could have a planned economy. But of course, I think that works, works in terms of delivering economic results, with a whole lot of political oppression, of course, in China, which is not a democracy. And there are ways in which you can maintain this body of experts and have a planned economy in a country that does not brook dissent in the way that India, thankfully, still formally does.
Right. In fact, China uses, in a way, data to not only tamp down but maybe cut off dissent.
Exactly.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean,
you know.
it cuts out dissent or knowledge of
Right.
dissent from the outside world as well,
Right.
right? There's the great firewall.
Right. No, that's fascinating, and especially given our understanding that one of the reasons maybe planning wasn't so good is that because although India had the best statistical systems at its time, but I mean, how good can it be? How much information can you
Right.
get in? At the end of the day, these planners are sort of working blind, at least to
Right.
some extent.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's
Uh,
worth remembering that planning does not represent just one person, Nehru, or one party, or one kind of economic policy.
right.
We've had planning in democratic countries, we've had planning in communist countries, we've had planning in communist countries that didn't work, like the Soviet Union, and planning in countries where it did work, like China. Planning in countries that were military dictatorships, like South Korea, planning in countries that were democratic and where it worked very well, like Japan, right? So we can have planning that's import substitution, our planning that's export led, which is not to say that this is an argument for planning, but just to understand the historical complexity and the different shades that this one word took on across the world.
Good. In fact, I think we've gone so much the other way that one of the uncontested things that everybody can agree that India did very well at that time, especially under Mr. Molanovic, was to build up these incredible statistical system, including the NSS over the NSS. So kind of it was vermooshed out of India. Like the last NSSO wasn't published, as Someja had written in the Business Standard. So I mean, what's what's is this another facet of our populist age that that we're going to diverge? We're not going to have data like China's going to have this massive data and it's going to control everyone, but we're going to have no data and we're just going to work on intuition of a big leader.
Yeah, I think that it's worth thinking about, even with China. There have been very valid questions raised about whether China has been upfront about its COVID death toll, right? And in fact, most people suspect that it has not been, especially in the early periods of the outbreak. And so having the data is not the same as being transparent with the data. And I
Right.
think in India, just like in China, it has been discovered that, as I write in the book, that good data is not always good politics. And that India's statistical system was once really the envy of the developing world, at least. In fact, some of the statistical advances made in India were seen as, even by statisticians in advanced economies like the UK and America, as just improbable, that it could not work. But it did. And development economists, including the Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton, have talked about how India's statistical system was really quite amazing for its time. But that has changed. In fact, just a few days ago, The Economist published an article about India's deteriorating statistical infrastructure. And while there
Right.
have been, the Indian government has never been under any government no institution has been immune from political meddling, especially, for example, under, say, Indira Gandhi. But I think in the last sort of 5 to 7 years, we have seen that the National Sample Survey data, household survey reports that was supposed to come out, say, in 2017, 2018, but was or supposed to be published in 2019, were either suppressed, just did not come out on time. And in fact, the Business Standard leaked a report that was supposed to come out
Wow.
but did not. And in fact, two members of the organization resigned in protest because the government suppressing the results. And what were the results? The results were that India was facing 30-year record unemployment. Since then, there have been other surveys that have been suppressed, which shows that India's household consumption has dropped dramatically. There have been surveys. There's a great debate about how many Indians are poor. The government claims that very, very few Indians are really poor in an absolute degree anymore. But most development economists, Martin Revalian, who works at the Center for Global Development, says that there's no way for economists to really tell because the last data set that they're working with is a data set from 2011, 2012, and it comes out every 5 years. The National Sample Survey carries out a 5-yearly extensive survey, and the one that was supposed to come out in 2017 just never came out. The government claimed that there were issues with the data quality. And so we're working with data that's 10 years old, and so you really can't tell what the Modi's government's poverty alleviation efforts, whether they've been successful or not, because the last data we have is from UPA2. And so the government really can't claim any of this without sharing this data. And this isn't just by political critics of the government. This is an aspect that's being critiqued by statisticians across the world, economists across the world, former chief economic advisors to the prime minister, like Kaushik Basu, a former chief economic advisor to the current prime minister, Arvind Subramanian, has written about it in the Financial Times. Nobel winner Abhijit Banerjee has written about it. Thomas Piketty has written about it. And a whole slew of Indian economists, of course, as well, have written about it, as I write in my book, ranging from JNU to MIT, and covering many economic and political positions in between. So I think that is a real blow to India's data infrastructure, and it's one that we might come to regret because it hinders the government in its capability to perform all kinds of activities. We've also seen in the recent week controversy about India's mortality numbers with COVID, right? And that's part, I think, of the same issue, which is that once you start getting worried about sharing data, I think that it is a slippery slope that you can go down. And of course, nobody really believes that India's mortality is under 500,000. I mean, that just seems most experts to be a severe undercount, and part of it is because we don't have good data gathering capabilities for that anymore.
Right, and it's really quite remarkable considering, I mean, India is still at the end of the day an aspiring welfare state that it could think that it could devise schemes and plans and for millions and crores of people without absolute data as basic as the NSS. So it's really quite remarkable, and I mean, it's really I mean, Mr. Modi himself is actually a big welfareist, but it's very much depending right now on, I think, the BJP and its feedback mechanisms, which I'm sure they're great, but I don't think they can match up to the NSSO and so on as the eyes and ears of the government. What I'd like to end off with is a bit of a tangent. One of the fascinating things I find about your book is you spend a lot of time trying to explain how Nehru actually, did this public outreach for the plans, because he wasn't in the Soviet Union, he wasn't in Maoist China. I mean, he really needed to bring these two ends together, the popular and the technocracy. And one of the most fascinating things I find is that he sort of endorsed a bit reluctantly a group of sadhus called the Bharatiya Sadhu Samaj. They still, I think, have an office in Delhi, given by the government. And one of the interesting things is, I want to go into a mind of a sadhu at that time, and we have these incredible debates about Nehru versus Modi, and this and that, and left versus right. And I wonder what he thought of Mr. Nehru, because I mean, for all he knew, Nehru was supporting his organization, and as you show in your book, I'm sure you'll expand on the Bharatiya Sadhu Samaj, then really shifted right. It left the Congress umbrella. It kind of reminded me a bit of actually Shahid Amin, I think, who's taught you also,
Yes.
is his subaltern history of Chauri Chaura, which was really an eye opener for me because their Gandhi was really in many ways a religious man, a miracle worker in a literal sense in some ways. And in some ways, I think for maybe for a sadhu in the Bharatiya Sadhu Samaj was Mr. Nehru, atheist, leftist, and so on, the way we would think of him, or was he just an Indian leader? I mean, did these debates percolate down to the ground, basically?
That's a great question, Shoaib. And I must confess that while it is the job of historians to get inside the minds of people and try to recreate their
Yeah.
motivations, getting inside the mind of a sadhu is particularly difficult for me because, of course,
Right.
the life of a sadhu is so different from that of even
Right.
sort of ordinary politicians of different political stripes, etc. Sadhus have to live a life of material and spiritual renunciation. I have a job, I have a family. So I mean, so getting into that is harder. And so
Right.
it's hard to know what the sadhu on the ground thought about Nehru, but we do have a sense of what the Bharatiya Sadhu Samaj thought about Nehru because we do have some of the writings from them. So just to bring the sort of the viewers up to speed,
Sure.
the Bharat Sadhu Samaj was an organization that was established in early 1956 at a meeting at Birla Mandir in Delhi between about 50 sadhus and representatives of the Congress government. So present were the President of India, Rajendra Prasad. There was Gulzarlal Nanda, who's the primary backer of this. Gulzarlal Nanda was a former Gandhian trade unionist, and he was at the time the sort of the planning minister for India. He would also for those interested, become a two-time interim prime minister of India. But Gulzar Nanda was a God-fearing, very devout Hindu, and he believed, as the minister of planning, that if planning was to be made popular, it had to be spread across the country in an idiom that was familiar to India's religious millions. And that idiom was Hinduism. And so he wanted sadhus to talk about the plan and to talk about the Ramayana and how it related to planning, and talk about the Mahabharata and how it related to planning, and to infuse this kind of religious language into the plans. So the Bharat Sadhu Samaj then became this organization that was an independent organization, but had as its honorary president and vice president Nehru and Gulzarlal Nanda. And so they made the most political mileage they could of this association. I would say that Nehru still remained deeply suspicious of them. Nehru himself was never somebody who was courting them. Nanda had to convince Nehru of the utility of this enterprise. He did manage to get them in the prime minister's office in front of Nehru once. But every address that we have from Nehru to the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, which is rare, has Nehru talking to the sadhus in which almost no contemporary politician would talk to these sadhus, right? It is extremely non-deferential. It is almost like he's scolding them. And it's very clear that he is very suspicious of what they will do. Because there had been, in fact, he has these intemperate outbursts in which he sometimes refers to sadhus as fakes, as spongers, or worse. And it's because there had been a host of crime reports at the time in the mid 1950s of sadhus or people who claimed to be sadhus engaging in illegal activities like fraud, kidnapping, or rape even. There was even a sadhu registration bill introduced in parliament. And the Bharat Sadhu Samaj took it seriously. The Bharat Sadhu Samaj said that this is a problem. We have many criminal elements amongst the sadhus. So if you want to be called a member of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, you need to apply to us and you need to have an identity card of saying that you are a registered sadhu of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, because to have our thappa on you. So I'd say that Nehru was extremely suspicious, but this is like a creature of Gulzarlal Nanda and of other religious figures such as Rajendra Prasad, who, of course, broke away from Nehru in going to re-inaugurate the Somnath temple, washed the feet of hundreds of Brahmin priests, the kinds of things that Nehru was very critical of and felt that the government, especially after the wounds of partition, should not be engaged in doing. But of course, the Bharatiya Sadhu Samaj got much more indulgent and deferential hearing from people like Indira Gandhi onwards. And as you point out, one of the dangers I think, of this kind of outreach is that the Bharat Sadhu Samaj had its own pet projects. It didn't really care so much about five-year planning. What it cared about is anti-cow slaughter. The first attack on Parliament in 1966 happens because a sadhu march which had been supported by Gulzar Nanda, turns into a riot in Delhi, killing many, hundreds injured. The police had to be called in. The police had to fire upon sadhus. They attacked Congress government ministers' houses. But also that from the 1960s onwards, the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, members of it, one person in particular, Tukdoji Maharaj, becomes one of the founder vice presidents of the VHP. Right? So its politics becomes far right. And by the late 1980s and 1990s, the Bharat Sadhu Samaj is basically a part of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement as well. Of course, going against the political interests of the Congress party and favoring the political interests of its arch rival, the BJP.
Well, thank you so much. That's Gulzar Nanda being introduced as two-time interim prime minister would be one of the sadder introductions that any politician has got. Thank you so much, Nikhil, for your time. This was absolutely fascinating, discussing the history of planning. Planning is discussed, I think, a lot from an economics perspective, as it should be. But I'm glad we discussed it in the form of ideas and politics and history and, of course, sadhus. Thank you so much for joining us, Nikhil.
Thank you so much, Daniel. This was a real pleasure.